Imagine being captured in war, expecting barbed wire, hunger, and humiliation, only to discover green fields, music on the radio, and warm meals on the table. For thousands of German prisoners of war in Allied hands during World War II, this was not a fantasy. It was their daily life. To many of them, the sudden shift from the front lines of destruction to the calm of American or British camps felt so surreal that they couldn't decide whether they were behind fences or inside a quiet paradise. But how did this happen, and why would their captors treat them this way? The story of German POWs in the West reveals a little-known chapter of history where compassion, strategy, and pragmatism collided in surprising ways. In this first part, we'll explore how these prisoners were captured, transported, and what their first impressions were when they entered the Allied camps. By 1943, Allied forces were capturing German soldiers in the thousands. North Africa campaigns alone brought entire units into captivity. When the Normandy invasion unfolded in June 1944, the trickle of prisoners turned into a flood. With every advance deeper into Europe, truckloads of captured Germans were escorted across the front and sent to holding camps before being shipped overseas. The numbers became staggering. Over 400,000 would eventually be transported to the United States alone, spread across nearly every state from Texas to Minnesota. Britain also held large contingents, though fewer than America, due to limited space and resources. For the German soldiers who had fought with everything they had, the journey into captivity began with exhaustion, confusion, and fear. They had been told stories of brutal treatment at enemy hands. Some expected beatings, starvation, or even execution. What they encountered instead was something very different. The first stop was often temporary enclosures near the battlefield. These were rough, hastily built pens with little more than barbed wire and tents. But the prisoners quickly noticed that Allied guards generally treated them with discipline rather than cruelty. Meals were given, medical treatment was offered, and orders were firm but not abusive. From there, trains and ships carried them across oceans. For many, arriving in the United States was a shock. Some expected to be locked in cells. Instead, they were unloaded into sprawling camps that looked more like small villages than prisons. Rows of wooden barracks stood in neat order, surrounded by fields with recreational areas, canteens, and even libraries. Guards were present, yes, but the atmosphere was closer to a military base than a dungeon. Food was one of the first surprises. Allied governments, bound by the Geneva Convention, provided prisoners with meals equivalent to those of their own soldiers. This meant 3 full servings a day, including meat, bread, vegetables, and coffee. For men who had survived on thin rations at the front, such abundance felt unbelievable. Many later recalled that they had eaten better in captivity than they ever had in the German army, especially during the later war years when shortages were extreme back home. Cigarettes, considered luxuries in wartime Europe, were also available for purchase at camp canteens. To men who had marched through mud and blood, the sudden stability of warm food and tobacco was nothing short of astonishing. Another shock came from the opportunities for activity. Camps often organized work programs, and prisoners could volunteer for agricultural or construction labor outside the barbed wire. They were paid small wages, redeemable at the camp store, where they could buy snacks, toiletries, or stationery. For farmers from rural Germany, working in American fields reminded them of home, except that these fields were peaceful, free of bombs and artillery. In fact, many U.S. farmers relied on POW labor to replace local men who had gone to fight overseas. Prisoners picked fruit in California, harvested wheat in the Midwest, and helped repair roads or build warehouses. Though still under guard, the sense of purpose gave many a feeling of dignity that pure confinement would not. Culture and leisure also played a role in making captivity less harsh. Camps frequently organized concerts, theatrical plays, and even orchestras formed entirely of prisoners. Some Germans, who had been musicians or actors before the war, entertained their fellow inmates. In certain camps, lectures and classes were offered, allowing prisoners to study languages, mathematics, or even engineering. For young soldiers who had been pulled from school to fight, this was an unexpected chance to continue their education. Libraries stocked with donated books allowed long hours of quiet reading. Sports, especially soccer, became a regular pastime with tournaments and organized teams. These activities did not erase the fact that the men were captives, but they filled the long months with structure and purpose. Perhaps the most striking contrast came from the environment itself. Instead of the rubble-strewn cities of Germany or the deserts of North Africa, many POWs found themselves in serene landscapes. Camps in the American Midwest, for example, were surrounded by open fields, forests, and rivers. In winter, snow blanketed the campyards, while in summer, green grass stretched to the horizon. For men who had seen nothing but battlefields for years, the peaceful scenery felt unreal. Some compared it to stepping out of hell into a dreamlike countryside. Yet not all prisoners adjusted easily. A portion of them, deeply loyal to the Nazi regime, viewed any comfort as a trap, fearing indoctrination or betrayal. They sometimes intimidated fellow prisoners, forming cliques that tried to maintain discipline and ideology even within the camps. Secret violence occurred in rare cases, with extremists punishing those seen as disloyal. But overall, such incidents were limited, and the majority of prisoners chose to focus on survival, adaptation, and the unexpected sense of relief that came with captivity. First impressions of Allied prison camps, therefore, defied expectations. Instead of hunger and fear, German POWs encountered rules, order, and a degree of respect. They were still behind fences, under guard, and far from their homeland. Yet many could not escape the feeling that their daily life had become easier than it had been on the front or even back in wartime Germany. For some, it was an embarrassment to admit. For others, it was a quiet blessing. They began to write letters home, describing conditions so favorable that their families could hardly believe them. And in the strange twists of war, captivity sometimes turned into an unexpected sanctuary, blurring the line between prison and paradise. This was only the beginning of their experience. The longer they stayed, the more complicated their lives became, as contact with locals, political re-education, and eventual repatriation added new layers to the story. But their first days in Allied hands left one lasting impression. Being captured was not the end of the world. It was, for many, the beginning of a life safer, healthier, and more hopeful than anything they had known in years of war. Life inside the camps quickly settled into a rhythm that astonished many of the German prisoners. After the shock of arriving and realizing they would not be mistreated, they began to adapt to the new reality. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be treated humanely, but the Allies often went beyond the minimum standard. Camps were built to house thousands, yet order and organization created a structured environment that resembled small communities more than cages. Within these communities, men discovered new roles, new opportunities, and sometimes even new identities. For soldiers who had marched and fought across ruined Europe, this was a world that seemed almost disconnected from the chaos outside. One of the most surprising elements was the degree of freedom permitted inside the wire. Prisoners organized their own camp life to a large extent. They formed councils, managed libraries, and scheduled concerts or theater plays. The Allies allowed this partly to maintain order, but it also had an unexpected effect. It gave the men a sense of control and normality. In some camps, entire symphony orchestras were assembled, rehearsing regularly and performing for fellow prisoners. Plays were staged with costumes and sets made from scraps of material. The arts became a powerful escape from the monotony of captivity, a reminder that their identities extended beyond the battlefield. Religion also played a role in camp life. Chaplains were permitted to visit, and makeshift chapels were built in barracks or open fields. Services were held regularly, and for many prisoners, faith offered comfort in uncertain times. Even among those who had been hardened by war, moments of reflection and prayer reminded them of family and tradition. For others, the experience was more secular but no less profound. Studying, playing soccer, or simply sitting under the trees gave them a peace they had not known for years. Contact with local civilians brought yet another dimension. Farmers, factory owners, and small businesses often employed prisoners on supervised work details. At first, many Americans and Britons were wary of interacting with former enemies, but as months passed, They discovered that the young men in German uniforms were often no different from their own sons or brothers. Conversations began in broken English and halting German, sometimes with the help of hand gestures. Over time, mutual respect developed. Stories circulated of POWs being invited to share meals with farm families or receiving small gifts. These interactions humanized both sides, eroding the image of faceless enemies. For the prisoners, it was a glimpse into everyday Allied life, and for civilians, it was proof that even former foes could be decent, hard-working men. The psychological shift among the POWs was profound. At first, many dreamed of escaping. Some even attempted it, tunneling under fences or slipping away during work assignments. But once outside, they realized that blending into American towns was nearly impossible. Language barriers, unfamiliar terrain, and the sheer vastness of the country made long-term escape a fantasy. More importantly, they discovered that they did not need to run. Life inside the camps was safer and more comfortable than life on the run or even life in war-torn Germany. Gradually, escape attempts dwindled, replaced by acceptance and adaptation. Not all experiences were idyllic. Some camps were stricter, with harsher discipline and fewer comforts. Tensions flared between prisoners loyal to Nazi ideology and those who simply wanted to endure captivity peacefully. Fights broke out, propaganda leaflets circulated, and in rare cases, intimidation turned violent. The Allies responded by separating hardline ideologues from moderates, reducing the influence of fanatics. These measures ensured that the overall atmosphere remained stable. But the reality of division within the German ranks revealed how deeply ideology had taken hold of some men. Still, the majority preferred to leave politics behind the wire and focus on surviving until war's end. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of captivity was the lasting impression it left. When the war finally ended in 1945, the process of repatriation began. Many prisoners were anxious to return home, to see family, and to rebuild shattered lives. Yet the return was not always joyous. Germany lay in ruins, cities destroyed, resources scarce. For some former POWs, the contrast between their lives in Allied camps and the devastation awaiting them at home was stark. Letters and memoirs reveal a strange sentiment. Some men admitted they had lived better as prisoners than they did after being freed. Their years in captivity had given them education, food, and safety, while their homeland offered only rubble and uncertainty. The Allies had also used captivity as an opportunity for re-education. Programs introduced democratic principles, exposed prisoners to Allied culture, and encouraged them to rethink the ideology they had once served. Not all embraced these lessons, but many quietly absorbed the values of freedom, individual rights, and cooperation. When they returned to Germany, they carried these ideas with them, influencing the post-war rebuilding of society. In this way, the experience of captivity became not just a personal chapter, but part of a larger transformation in Europe. For decades after the war, German veterans who had been POWs in the West reflected on their experiences with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. They spoke of meals shared with guards, soccer matches in dusty camp yards, and nights spent reading in makeshift libraries. They contrasted these memories with the stories of comrades who had been captured in the East, where conditions were far harsher and survival was uncertain. The difference was so great that some called their years in American or British camps a kind of salvation, a pause in the storm of history that gave them a chance to live, learn, and hope again. The story of German prisoners of war in Allied camps challenges many assumptions about what captivity means. It was not paradise in a literal sense. These men were far from home, separated from family, and uncertain of the future. Yet, compared to the front lines they had left behind, or the ruins they returned to, their time behind Allied fences often felt like a strange, unexpected blessing. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of war, humanity can emerge in unexpected ways. Guards and prisoners, enemies on paper, sometimes found themselves united by shared decency, respect, and the simple desire for peace. and that is why many German POWs could never decide whether they had been living in a prison or in a paradise disguised by barbed wire. Their story is one of contradictions, resilience, and the surprising ways war can turn enemies into neighbors. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video so more people can discover these hidden chapters of history.